My name is Daniel, and I never thought I would end up living in a place like this. The house on Crestwood Lane was far too big for just the three of us, my wife, Clara, our daughter, Mia, and me. But when we saw it, something about it felt right. At first, everything seemed fine. The house was old but charming, and it felt perfect for our family. But soon, strange things started to happen. I began hearing whisper soft, unintelligible voices coming from the walls. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling, but the whispers grew louder. One night, while lying in bed, I heard them again, clearer this time. Daniel, ... The voice was raspy, echoing from behind the headboard. I froze, heart racing. I turned to Clara, but she was sound asleep. I chalked it up to my imagination. The next morning, I decided to check. I searched every room, the basement, and even the attic. I found nothing. Clara thought I was stressed, and I began to doubt myself. But Mia started hearing the whispers too. One evening, she came running down the stairs, terrified. "Daddy," the voices. There in my room, we rushed upstairs. The whispers were unmistakable, coming from the walls of her room, louder now, almost pleading. "Mia, ... come closer, ... I grabbed her and pulled her out. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers, growing louder. Desperate for answers, I researched the house's history. I found a newspaper article from the 1940s about Thomas Blackwell, the former owner. He was a reclusive artist who disappeared mysteriously, and neighbors claimed to have heard strange noises from the house before he vanished. As I read, dread washed over me. The whispers weren't just random sounds, they were tied to something darker. I had to know more. That night, I sat in the living room, listening. At first, silence. But then, the whispers returned, clearer than ever. "Daniel, come closer." I stood up and approached the wall, my hand pressing against the wood. Suddenly, the wall shifted, cracking open, revealing a hidden passageway. I grabbed a flashlight and entered the tunnel. At the end, I found a small, dusty room. In the center was a painting of Thomas Blackwell. His dark eyes followed me as I stood frozen. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. "Daniel, join me." I ran back to the house, but the whispers followed, echoing in the walls. It was then I realized the house wasn't just haunted, it was trapping us. The spirit of Thomas Blackwell had been waiting for someone to join him. My name is Eva, and when we bought the house on Maple Street, I had no idea how much it would change our lives. It wasn't a particularly old house, just a few decades old, but something about it felt timeless. We had recently moved to the area to start fresh after the birth of our first child, and the house seemed perfect for our little family. The first few weeks were wonderful, peaceful, and quiet, but then I noticed something strange. There was an old mirror hanging in the hallway, right across from our bedroom. It was large, with an ornate frame that looked like it came from another time. The mirror was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but every time I passed the mirror, I felt as though I was being observed. I told my husband, Luke, but he dismissed it. "It's just a mirror," he said. But I knew it was more than that. It started with small things, glimmers of movement in the reflection when no one was there, flickers of light in the glass that didn't match the room's lighting. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the unease grew. I started to avoid walking past it, but the mirror was always there, watching. One night, after putting our son Oliver to bed, I decided to face my fears. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I looked deeper, something strange happened. The reflection shifted, For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. Her eyes were dark and hollow, full of sorrow. Her face was pale, gaunt, as if she hadn't seen sunlight in years. I stepped back, heart pounding, but then the reflection smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was cold, twisted, and the woman in the mirror began to move, her hand reaching out toward me. I screamed and turned away, running out of the hallway. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face and heard her voice whispering, urging me to come closer. The next day, I researched the house. I found an old newspaper article about Margaret, the previous owner. She had gone missing under mysterious circumstances, and no one knew what had happened to her. Some said she ran off, others thought she died in the house, but no one knew for sure. I also found a photo of her, a black and white image of a woman with the same hollow eyes, the same sad smile. My heart skipped a beat when I realized she was the same woman I had seen in the mirror that night. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get rid of the mirror. It was the only solution. I took it off the wall, wrapped it in a cloth, and shoved it into the attic, hoping that would end it. But the next morning, the mirror was back in the hallway. It was as if it had never been moved. Frantic, I told Luke everything. He agreed something was wrong, and we decided to take action. Together, we dragged the mirror into the backyard and smashed it into pieces. As the glass shattered, I felt a wave of relief. It was finally over, or so I thought. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard someone softly crying. At first I thought it was Oliver, but he was asleep. The crying grew louder, coming from the hallway. I went to investigate, heart racing. As I passed where the mirror had once hung, I felt the temperature drop. The air grew heavy, and I could see my breath. And then I saw her. Margaret was standing at the end of the hallway, her face pale and twisted. Her eyes were dark and empty. She was crying, her hands reaching out toward me. I froze, knowing in that moment the mirror had never been the problem. The house itself was cursed, and Margaret's spirit was trapped here, haunting us. I don't know how much longer we can stay, but I do know one thing. Margaret is still watching, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. And when that moment comes, I fear she'll take me with her. My name is Claire, and when my husband Matt and I decided to move into the large, sprawling house on the edge of town, I had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. The house was beautiful, nestled on a hill with a wide lawn and tall, ancient trees that gave it an air of mystery. It had been abandoned for years, but the price was too good to pass up. We thought it would be the perfect place to raise a family. The first few weeks were full of excitement and optimism as we explored our new home. The house was massive, with rooms I had only dreamed of in the city. One room in particular, an attic space, intrigued me. It was tucked away at the top of the house, and though it seemed small, there was a strange, haunting quality to it. I could feel it every time I went up. There the air was thicker, colder, and there was an old rocking horse sitting in the corner, its paint chipped and faded. Matt didn't think much of it. He thought I was being overly cautious and that I was just letting my imagination run wild. But things started to happen that made me question my sanity. It began with the sound of footsteps in the hallway at night. At first I thought it was Matt walking around, but when I asked him about it, he swore he hadn't gotten out of bed. The footsteps were always light, slow, as if someone was tiptoeing through the house. The sound would come and go, but it never failed to make my heart race. One night, I decided to investigate. I crept down the hall, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I neared the attic door, I heard the soft sound of a child's laughter, faint but distinct. My breath caught in my throat. I opened the attic door slowly, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, except for the rocking horse which seemed to be positioned differently from the last time I saw it. My skin crawled, but I convinced myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me. The sounds continued every night: footsteps, whispers, the eerie laughter. I decided to research the history of the house, hoping to find an explanation for the strange occurrences. What I found made my blood run cold. The house had once belonged to a family, a mother, father, and their young child. The child, a little girl named Lily, had mysteriously disappeared one night. The parents were devastated, but despite their efforts, Lily was never found. Rumors spread that she had wandered into the woods and had been lost forever, but the truth was much darker. As I read through the old newspaper articles, I learned that the house had been abandoned after Lily's disappearance, and no one had dared to live there for years. It was said that the house was cursed, that the spirit of the little girl still roamed the halls, searching for something or someone. My mind raced with fear. Could it be Lily's ghost that was haunting us? That night I decided to confront whatever was in the house. I went to the attic, the place where I felt the presence most strongly. I sat in the dark, holding my breath, waiting. The rocking horse was still there, motionless, staring at me with its empty eyes. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and I heard the faint sound of a child humming a lullaby. My heart pounded in my chest. The rocking horse began to move on its own, slowly rocking back and forth, its creaky sound piercing the silence of the attic. I jumped up, backing away toward the door, but before I could reach it, I felt something cold, icy fingers brushing against my leg. I looked down and saw a small hand, barely visible in the dim light, reaching out from beneath the rocking horse. I screamed and ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. Matt woke up, alarmed by the noise, and rushed to my side. I told him everything, but he was skeptical, as usual. He tried to comfort me, telling me it was just a figment of my imagination, but I knew what I had felt, and I wasn't going to ignore it anymore. The next day, I decided to get rid of the rocking horse. I didn't want any part of it in the house, but when I went to the attic, it was gone. The space where it had been was empty. I searched the entire house, but I couldn't find it. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. The following night, I heard the sound of the footsteps again, this time coming closer. I wasn't sure what to do, but I grabbed my phone and tried to record the sounds. The video footage showed nothing, but when I listened closely, I heard a whispering voice, soft and distant. "Don't leave me." The next day, we packed up and left. I couldn't bear the thought of staying in that house any longer, not with whatever was there, waiting for us. We moved far away, and I thought I could finally leave it behind. But every now and then, when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear the faint sound of a child's laughter, echoing from somewhere in the distance. My name is Lily, and when my husband, Tom, and I moved into the old farmhouse on Birchwood Lane, we thought it would be the perfect place to start our family. The house was a bit remote, but we loved the peaceful surroundings and the big yard. The price was more than reasonable for such a large property, and despite its age, the house seemed solid. It had that nostalgic charm: creaky floors, a grand staircase, and windows that let in streams of sunlight. But there was something about it, something I couldn't shake, that told me this place had secrets. The first few weeks were peaceful. We spent our time unpacking and making the house our own, but as soon as we began renovating, things started to get strange. At first, it was little things: scratching sounds coming from the walls in the dead of night, faint whispers when no one was around, and a cold draft that seemed to follow me from room to room. I tried to ignore it, but Tom noticed it too. "It's just an old house, settling," he said. But I knew this was something different. Then the screams started. It began one night, just after we had gone to bed. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard a loud, anguished scream coming from the walls. It wasn't just a sound, It felt like the walls themselves were crying out in pain. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, listening, but the scream was gone as quickly as it had come. I thought I was imagining it. But the next night, it happened again. "Did you hear that?" I asked Tom, shaking him awake. He listened for a moment, his face hardening. "Yeah, I heard it," he said quietly. "What the hell was that?" The next day, we decided to investigate. We thought it was an animal, perhaps a rodent, trapped inside the walls. But when we cut into the drywall, there was nothing, no evidence of any animal, no sign of a nest or any kind of damage, just empty space. That night, the screaming was louder. It was almost as if the walls were alive with the sound of pain, as though something or someone was trapped inside, begging to be released. It was unnerving, and this time, neither of us could sleep. I insisted that we leave. But Tom didn't want to give up on our dream home just yet. The next few days brought more terrifying events. Objects in the house began to move on their own, books would fall from shelves, doors would open and close by themselves, and the lights would flicker constantly. But the most disturbing thing was the whispering. Every room I entered, I could hear soft voices murmuring just out of reach. Sometimes, they sounded like a woman crying, other times like children giggling, and at times, like a man speaking in a language I couldn't understand. And always, the screams echoed in the walls. One night, unable to take it anymore, I went down into the basement to see if I could find anything that would explain the noises. The basement was dark and damp, with an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I walked around, my flashlight casting long shadows on the old stone walls, when I saw something, a series of scratches on the floor, leading toward the far corner. As I got closer, I noticed a large, wooden chest tucked away beneath a pile of old newspapers. It looked ancient, with rusted hinges, and a lock that had long since corroded. I opened it. Inside, there was nothing at first. But then, something shifted. In the darkness, something soft and crumpled at the bottom. I reached in, my fingers trembling, and pulled out an old, yellowed piece of paper. It was a letter, written in elegant handwriting, but the words were barely legible. I could make out a few phrases, and my blood ran cold as I read them aloud. ... Trapped in the walls. ... Screaming to be freed. ... Never leave the house. The house feeds on pain. ... A chill ran down my spine. The letter seemed to come from someone who had once lived in the house, a family, perhaps. As I stared at the paper, the air around me grew colder, and I could hear faint whispers from the walls, as though the house itself was speaking. I rushed back upstairs, clutching the letter in my hand. That night, the screaming was louder than ever. The walls seemed to be shaking, vibrating with the intensity of the cries that echoed through the house. It felt as though something was trying to break free, something angry and desperate. By morning, Tom was convinced we couldn't stay any longer. "I don't know what's going on here," he said, his face pale. "But I'm not staying to find out." We left the farmhouse that day, never looking back. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time. The windows were dark, but for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a shadow standing at the window, watching us. I don't know who or what is trapped in those walls, but I know one thing: that house is alive with something ancient and hungry, and whatever it is, it's still waiting. My name is Sarah, and moving into an old house on the outskirts of town seemed like the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. Jake, and I had been looking for a quiet place to start our future together, and this house, though a bit run down, had everything we needed. It was secluded, charming, and had a large garden that I immediately fell in love with. The house had a rich history, and though it was a little on the eerie side, I was eager to make it our home from the moment we arrived. There was something about the nursery upstairs that caught my attention. It was a small room, filled with antique furniture and old crib, faded wallpaper, and a rocking chair that seemed almost too perfect. I could tell that this room had once been a place of joy, but now it was just a forgotten corner of the house. Jake, on the other hand, didn't share my fascination. He didn't like the room from the start, always claiming it gave him a strange feeling whenever he passed by it. "It's just an old room," I told him, brushing off his concerns. But the more time I spent in that room, the more unsettled I felt. The first strange thing happened the night we decided to start unpacking the nursery. We were sitting on the floor, sorting through boxes, when I heard a soft giggling coming from the corner. I froze, my blood running cold. "Did you hear that?" I asked Jake. He looked at me with a confused expression. "Hear what?" he replied. The giggling faded quickly, and I chalked it up to my imagination. But as the days went by, the strange occurrences escalated. One evening, I was sitting in the nursery, working on some decorations, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. It was faint, almost as if it was coming from behind the walls. I rushed to the door, my heart pounding, but when I opened it, there was no one there. Jake wasn't convinced. "Sarah, you're just stressed. It's an old house. Houses settle, and they make noises," he insisted. But it wasn't just the sounds. Strange things started happening around the house. The light fixtures flickered, the temperature in certain rooms dropped drastically, and I began to notice dark smudges on the walls that seemed to appear out of nowhere. One night, I was in the kitchen when I saw it through the window. Just beyond the garden there was a figure standing in the nursery window. I thought it was Jake playing a prank, but when I went outside to check, no one was there. The nursery window was dark and empty. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. A few days later, I decided to do some research on the house's history. I found an old newspaper article from the early 1900s about a young couple who had lived there. The article mentioned that they had a baby, but the child had died under mysterious circumstances. The house had been empty for years after their deaths, and the couple's spirits were rumored to haunt the nursery. The next evening, the crying returned. This time, it was louder, clearer, and impossible to ignore. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed to the nursery. When I entered, I felt a cold wind rush past me, and the door slammed shut behind me. The room was freezing, the temperature plummeting to the point where I could see my breath. The rocking chair in the corner was moving, on its own, creaking as it rocked back and forth. I took a step forward, my heart racing, and that's when I saw the crib was shaking. The baby's cries were deafening, and the room felt like it was closing in on me. I tried to reach the door, but it wouldn't open. I was trapped. Suddenly, the cries stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, and I turned around, only to see a shadow in the corner of the room. It was the outline of a woman, her face pale and expressionless. She was holding something in her arms, something that looked like a bundle wrapped in cloth. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen in place as she slowly turned toward me, her eyes hollow and dark. "Leave this place," she whispered, her voice a cold, lifeless breath. I ran. The door flew open, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. Jake found me moments later, pale and shaken. He didn't believe what I had seen, but I knew that the spirit of the woman who had lost her child was still in the nursery, trapped in the house. We didn't stay another night. We packed our things and left before morning. To this day, I can still hear the cries of the baby in the quiet of the night, echoing in my mind. My name is Emma, and my husband Mark and I had just moved into an old Victorian house on Oak Street. It was a beautiful house, with grand wooden floors, high ceilings, and large windows that let in the sunlight. We had been searching for the perfect home for months, and when we saw this one, we knew it was the one. It had everything we wanted: character, charm, and the perfect space to start a family. The house seemed almost too perfect. We fell in love with it immediately. The first few days were spent unpacking and decorating. The house felt warm, welcoming, and full of potential. However, there was one feature that Mark and I both found strange: a large, antique mirror in the hallway near the stairs. It was framed in intricate silver, the kind of frame that seemed to hold centuries of stories within its ornate details. It was beautiful, but something about it didn't feel quite right. The first night we spent in the house was uneventful, but the second night was when things started to get strange. I woke up around 3 a.m., unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced around the room, and that's when I noticed a reflection in the mirror. It was out of place, slightly off from the angle where the mirror should be reflecting the hallway. I thought I was just seeing things, so I tried to ignore it, but the next night, it happened again. This time, I was certain there was something in the mirror that wasn't supposed to be there. A shadow, dark and distorted, stood behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I looked back at the mirror, but the shadow was gone. My heart began to race, and I didn't know what to think. I told Mark the next morning, but he was skeptical. "It's probably just your mind playing tricks on you. You're tired, Emma," he said, brushing it off. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Every time I passed the mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, as though the reflection had a life of its own. Things got worse as the days went on. I began hearing whispers in the hallway late at night. Sometimes, I would hear footsteps, but when I checked, there was never anyone there, and each time I passed the mirror, it felt like the shadow in the reflection grew larger, more menacing. One evening, as Mark and I were sitting in the living room, we heard a loud crash. We rushed to the hallway, only to find that the mirror had fallen from the wall, shattering into pieces on the floor. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. We decided to clean up the mess, but as I bent down to pick up a shard of glass, I noticed something terrifying. Among the broken pieces, there was one large fragment that still reflected the hallway. In that reflection, I saw the shadow again. This time, it was standing right behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around, but there was no one there. I looked back at the shard of glass, and the shadow was gone. But I knew it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Something in that mirror had been waiting for us, something that didn't belong in the world. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, watching the hallway from the safety of the living room, waiting for something to happen. It wasn't long before I heard the soft whispering again, coming from the direction of the broken mirror. I crept down the hallway, holding my breath. When I reached the spot where the mirror had fallen, I noticed something chilling. The shadow was still there, not in the mirror, but in the hallway itself. It was standing at the top of the stairs, its form dark and distorted, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. My heart raced as I backed away, but the shadow moved closer, its form stretching and warping. It seemed to grow, expanding with every step I took backward. In a panic, I turned and ran, not looking back until I was safely in the living room. I told Mark everything, but he still didn't believe me. He thought I was imagining things, but I knew what I saw. That mirror, it wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway to something that didn't belong in our world. The next day, we packed our things and left. We never returned to the house on Oak Street. We found another place to live, far away from the nightmare we had experienced. But even now, sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that shadow in the reflection, waiting. My name is Jack, and my wife, Laura, and I were excited to move into our first home together. After months of searching, we finally found a charming little house on a quiet street. It was perfect, quaint, with a white picket fence, and just the right size for us to start our life. The house had been on the market for a while, but when we visited, it felt right. The price was a steal, and the real estate agent assured us that it was just an old house in need of a little TLC. The first few weeks were blissfully uneventful. We unpacked, made repairs, and got to know our new neighborhood. But then, things started to feel ... off. It was subtle at first. Doors that were left open would sometimes be closed when we returned home. Lights that had been switched off would flicker back on. It was small stuff, but it unsettled me. One night, I was in the kitchen, making dinner while Laura relaxed in the living room. I heard footsteps, upstairs, light, slow, deliberate. I assumed it was Laura walking around, so I didn't think much of it. But when I called out to her, she answered from the living room, confused. "I'm right here." "Why?" I froze. The footsteps continued, moving toward the stairwell. I tried to brush it off as the house settling, but something about it didn't sit right. The next day, I checked the attic, thinking maybe there was an animal up there, but it was empty, just old boxes and dusty beams. No signs of anything unusual. The noises didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Every night, the footsteps grew louder, as though someone was walking back and forth in the upstairs hallway. But when I checked, no one was there. Sometimes, I would hear the faint sound of children laughing, distant and muffled, as if coming from the walls themselves. It was a cold Tuesday evening when I discovered something I couldn't ignore. I had been in the basement, sorting through old boxers, when I found a framed photograph buried beneath some papers. The photo was old, black and white, showing a family standing in front of the house. A man, woman, and 2 children. Their smiles were stiff, their eyes vacant, as though they weren't really there. But what struck me the most was the year written on the back, 1947. I stared at the photo, a chill creeping up my spine. There was something about the way they looked at the camera that felt wrong. They seemed ... out of place, as if they didn't belong in this time. That night, the footsteps came again, but this time, they were accompanied by the sound of a door creaking open, followed by soft whispers, voices I couldn't understand. Laura and I both heard it, and we were both too terrified to move. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they felt as though they were right next to us. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The next morning, I decided to do some research. I visited the local library, digging into the history of the house. What I found shocked me. The house had once belonged to a family, the Callaways, who had mysteriously disappeared in the late 1940s. The police had investigated, but no trace of the family was ever found. There were rumors, though whispers, of something terrible happening in the house. Something that had driven them to leave without a trace. I returned home that afternoon, feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that the Callaways were still here, still trapped in the house somehow. That night, the whispers came again, but this time, they were more distinct. I could hear the words, "Help us. We're still here. Don't let us go." I decided to confront it. I grabbed a flashlight and went up to the attic once more. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain. I stood at the top of the stairs, calling out to the spirits, asking them to leave us alone. But the only answer was the sound of children crying, echoing through the attic. I stepped inside, my breath shallow. The air was cold, the whispers growing louder. Then, I saw them. The figures, pale blurry shapes, hovering in the corner of the attic. They were the family from the photo. The man, woman, and children, standing in a frozen silence. I tried to speak, but no words came out. I was paralyzed, unable to move, as their hollow eyes turned toward me, their mouths opening in silent screams. And then, in an instant, they were gone. I ran downstairs, my heart racing. The house was silent, but I knew they were still there, watching, waiting. The Callaways weren't gone. They were trapped in this house, and they wouldn't rest until they found someone else to take their place. We couldn't stay any longer. We packed up and left that night, leaving the house behind. As we drove away, I glanced back. In the attic window, I saw them, the family, standing in the darkness, staring at us. My name is Olivia, and I'll never forget the day we moved into our new home on Hawthorne Lane. It was a beautiful household, but full of character. My husband, David, and I were thrilled to start a new life in a place that felt like it had history. The house had a huge attic, and it immediately caught my attention. It was the perfect spot for storage, or so I thought at first. Everything seemed fine. The house was spacious, the rooms were cozy, and we settled in quickly. But from the moment we arrived, there was something unsettling about the attic. It wasn't just the heavy door or the dust-covered floorboards. There was a strange feeling that lingered in the air, like something was waiting, watching. The first few nights were uneventful, but around the second week, I started hearing strange noises coming from the attic. At first, it was faint, the sound of something shifting, like old furniture being moved. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the house settling. But as the days went on, the noises grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just movement, it was footsteps. One evening, I decided to investigate. David was out of town for work, and I was alone in the house. The noises from the attic had been persistent all day, and I couldn't ignore them any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and headed up to the attic, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment I opened the attic door, the temperature dropped. A cold draft swept past me, making me shiver. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around the room. The attic was filled with old furniture and boxes, just like I had expected. But there was something else there, presence that seemed to fill the space. I called out, "Hello, is someone up here?" My voice echoed in the empty space, but there was no answer. The footsteps had stopped, and for a brief moment, the room was silent. I moved further into the attic, my flashlight flickering as I walked, as I passed an old, dust-covered mirror leaning against the wall. I noticed something strange in the reflection and outline, a figure standing behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. My breath caught in my throat. Then, I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible. "Help me." I froze, the blood in my veins turning cold. The voice wasn't David's. It was faint, distant, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the walls. I followed the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. It led me to a small door at the far end of the attic, one I hadn't noticed before. It was old, wooden, and had a rusty padlock hanging from the handle. I didn't think twice. I grabbed the padlock and tried to pull it off. It was stubborn, rusted from years of neglect, but after a few tries, it came loose. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow space behind it. The air was thick and musty, and I could barely see anything, even with my flashlight. I stepped inside, my heart racing. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. "Help me, please, I turned a corner, and there, lying on the floor, was a small, dusty journal. I picked it up, flipping through the pages, and the words sent a chill down my spine. It was a diary written by a woman named Margaret, who had once lived in the house. The entries described strange events, noises in the walls, whispers from the attic, a shadow that followed her at night. As I read, I realized with horror that Margaret's last entry was dated the day before she disappeared. She had written about seeing a figure in the attic, a dark shape that had been watching her for weeks. The last line of the diary read, "It's not just the house, it's the thing in the attic. It won't let me go." I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. The whispering had stopped, but the air felt thick with an oppressive presence. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang from the far end of the attic. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating nothing but the old furniture and boxers. Then, I saw it a shadow, moving swiftly toward me, growing larger with each step. My heart raced as I turned and ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't breathe. The footsteps were right behind me, but when I looked back, no one was there. David came home later that night, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him what happened. The house felt different now. He couldn't see what I saw, but I knew. The thing in the attic was real, and it wasn't going to stop. My name is Greg, and my wife Sarah and I had just moved into a large, old farmhouse on the edge of town. The house was perfect for starting a family, with a big backyard and enough space for us to grow. We were excited for a new chapter, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The first few days were fine. We unpacked our boxes, arranged furniture, and settled into our new routine. But as the days went by, Sarah started to notice strange things. The house was quiet to quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. There were no creaks in the floorboards, no hum of the refrigerator, no distant sounds of cars passing by, just silence. Then, one night, it started. I was sitting in the living room reading a book when I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the walls. I thought it was just the wind or the house settling, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. A voice low and murmuring, as if someone was right next to me. I stood up, heart racing, and listened. The whispering seemed to move, traveling from one room to another, like it was circling the house. I called out, "Sarah, is that you?" But no answer came. I checked the house from top to bottom, but there was no one there. The whispering stopped for the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next few nights, the whispering returned. It wasn't just in the walls anymore, it was in the floors, the ceilings, and even the air. It was as if the house itself was trying to communicate with us. The voices grew louder, and sometimes they would say my name, or Sarah's, as if they were trying to get our attention. One evening, I decided to confront it. I grabbed a flashlight and went down to the basement, the only part of the house that seemed untouched by the whispers. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be coming from the walls, from behind the pipes, from deep within the foundation of the house. I shined my light around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing, just the walls, the pipes, and the shadows. Then, in the far corner of the basement, I noticed something strange, an old wooden door that I hadn't seen before. It was cracked, slightly open, as if someone had been through it recently. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but something drew me toward it. I slowly walked over to the door and pushed it open. Behind it was a narrow, dark hallway that led into the earth. The air was damp and musty, and the walls were covered in ancient carvings, symbols I didn't recognize. The whispering was deafening now, coming from deep within the earth, almost as if it was alive. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The floor beneath me creaked, and the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in darkness. The whispers grew louder, until they were no longer whispers. They were voices, hundreds of voices, all speaking at once, begging for release. I tried to back away, but the hallway seemed to stretch farther and farther, pulling me deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, I heard Sarah's voice. "Greg, where are you?" I turned, but there was no sign of her. The voices were everywhere now, screaming, pleading. I ran back to the door, but it wouldn't open. I was trapped, just as I thought. I couldn't take it anymore. The door finally burst open. I fell backward into the basement, gasping for breath. The whispering stopped. The air was still. When I returned upstairs, Sarah was waiting for me, her face pale with worry. "What happened? Where did you go?" she asked. I looked at her, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I didn't know what I had seen, or what had happened in that hallway, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in this house, it wanted us to leave, and it wouldn't stop until we did. My name is Emily, and my family had just moved to a small, quiet town. We found an old house on Maple Street, perfect for a fresh start. The neighbors were friendly, the schools were good, and the house itself had a charm to it. The kind of charm that made you forget about the passing years. From the outside, the house was beautiful, large windows, an overgrown garden, and a tall oak tree in the front yard that looked like it had been there for centuries. But when we moved in, things felt ... off. Little things, shadows that seemed to linger too long, cold drafts in rooms that should have been warm. The first night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises in the walls, like scratching. I thought it was just old house sounds settling, creaking. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It started at the same time every night, around 2 a.m. Just when I was about to drift off, the scratching would start again. I thought I was imagining things, but the rest of the family started to notice it too. My mom chalked it up to rats, but we never found any. Dad figured it was the house's age, maybe some pipes or wires acting up. But the scratching only grew louder. One evening, while I was exploring the attic, I found something strange. An old, dust-covered mirror tucked in the corner, half hidden under a pile of broken furniture. When I moved it, something caught my eye in the reflection. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a face behind me, a pale, ghostly face with hollow eyes. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. My heart raced, and I quickly shoved the mirror back where I found it. After that, I started to feel like I wasn't alone in the house. I would catch glimpses of something moving out of the corner of my eye. I tried to brush it off, thinking I was just tired or stressed from the move. But then, the footsteps started. At night, I would hear them, soft, slow steps, pacing the hallway, outside my door. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling again, but it wasn't the same as before. This was different. The steps weren't random. They followed a pattern, stopping at my door before retreating back down the hallway. One night, after the steps had passed, I decided to follow them. I crept out of bed and made my way to the hallway. The house was dark, but I could see the faint light from the street lamps outside filtering through the windows. The steps were faint at first, but they grew louder as I approached the stairs. I reached the bottom of the stairs and froze. Standing at the foot of the staircase was a shadow, a tall, thin figure that seemed to blend with the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't move. The figure didn't seem to notice me, but it was staring at the stairs, as if waiting for something. Suddenly, the figure turned its head, and its eyes met mine. They were empty, just two hollow sockets, staring back at me. I gasped, but the figure was already gone, fading into the shadows like it had never been there. I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I could hear the footsteps again, but this time they were faster, more frantic, like someone or something was running through the house. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, too terrified to close my eyes. The next day, I tried to tell my parents, but they just brushed it off. "You're just adjusting to the move, sweetie," my mom said. "Old houses can be creepy sometimes, but nothing's wrong." But I knew something was wrong. The house was alive in a way that I couldn't explain, and whatever it wasn't going to let us leave.